Hello, folks. Welcome to the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic. I'm here with Jerry Lund. And perhaps, Jerry, you could give us some background, some genesis as to how the museum came about.
This is a really old museum. It actually, the genesis of it goes back to 1948. So not long after the end of the Second World War, some retired naval personnel thought it would be a good idea to pull together some marine artifacts. And essentially that's what it was. It was a slowly building collection of artifacts that had a variety of homes in different parts of Halifax. Then in 1982, by 1982, a new permanent home had been built, and that's the site where we are now on Lower Water Street. And we've been here for well on 40 years. This current museum is actually comprised of an older historic building, the Robertson Building, and the newer Devonian wing, where we find ourselves today. And the Robertson Ship Chandlery has been restored as a period restoration, pretty much looking like what a ship chandlery would have looked like 100, 120 years ago.
All right, for the sake of the folks out there, could you tell them what a chandlery is?
That would be like a marine hardware store. If you were a ship owner and you needed anything from a sail needle to an anchor, you'd go to a ship chandler's. And that's actually, I think of it as the equivalent of a hardware store today, where if you're in a particular profession, you go in and you're just agog at what is available. Robertson Ship Chandlery would have been one of dozens and dozens around the province.
Now, these ships that were in this gallery, these were all donated?
We're very fortunate to have a public who just have a passion for the sea. And, you know...
What's to say you're only, 50 kilometers from the sea?
Wherever you are
in Nova Scotia.
Exactly.
Right? So it's determined our character in a lot of ways.
That's exactly right. The lovely Vagabond, which you see behind it, that's designed, this beautiful sloop was designed by William Ruy, who, of course, designed Bluenose. So you're quite right. Many of the objects, the boats or any of the other thousands of objects that we have here, have primarily been donated. Not all of them. When certain objects are identified that are thought to be of particular value to that marine heritage of this area, we will actively pursue it and make the occasional purchase.
The idea is to preserve a part of our history so that it's not lost and the future generations can, of course, enjoy it.
That's exactly right. The wonderful thing, I've been working here for almost 29 years, and the wonderful thing that I've found about this museum, beyond just the generosity of Nova Scotians to want to see that maritime heritage preserved, is even now, after 28 years, I will go into various parts of this museum and I will see objects that remind me of my youth growing up in a small fishing community in Cape Breton. And the Robertson Ship Chandlery, it is a location where people of a certain age will wander in. They'll take a deep breath and smell that pine tar that was used to preserve.
Memory is attached to smell.
Memory is attached to smell. Memory is attached for many people to just the simplest of objects. And those are the kinds of objects that for many people who grew up in Nova Scotia or in the Atlantic provinces, they're those touchstones to memory. And that's what we preserve here.
I remember when you'd go into some of the general stores in the country where they'd have a ball of twine up and they'd bring the twine down and it'd be paper and they'd wrap everything with the twine and paper.
That's the exact memory that I have when I wander into the Robertson Ship Chandlery.
Exactly.
The cast iron bell that the ball of string would wobble in when the string was pulled up to wrap up the paper.
It's amazing, what you think of when you see these things.
That's exactly right.
They're in your memory.
Yep.
Right? But it takes a little trigger to bring them out, doesn't it?
To bring them out, yep.
And especially from people who aren't from the Maritimes, to get an idea of that this was the life here.
You raise a very important point, because over the last 40 years that this museum has been in this location, you can imagine a museum of that age, we told stories in different ways 40 years ago compared to the way that we tell them today. So this museum has taken on the task of recognizing that there are significant gaps in the stories that we tell. There are people who visit our museum who can't see themselves and see their heritage reflected in what we have at the museum. And we're embarking on a process to identify those gaps, to try and make sure that we're relevant to anyone who comes in, whether they be people who've fourth, fifth generation Canadian or new Canadians. It's important that there be those touchstones to memory, whether it's to this culture or perhaps it's a touchstone to their own culture if they are a new Canadian. So that's what we're aiming to do. The way I like to think of the role of our museum was, if we were one of the first places that that visitor would drop into, what they would see here, they would know more about as they embarked on their journeys around the province to all of these small communities, so that they would be better informed of the context of what they would see here.
And I think you're doing a very good job with it.
Well, thank you very much.
On a personal, this is one of the few first museums that my wife and I visited when we came here in
That's
2000.
wonderful.
It's to see, you can almost imagine what somebody would have been like in that boat in 1920.
Yeah.
Maybe they were running rum down to Boston.
Rum running is one of those exhibits which I would love, one of those gaps.
And
that
I'm
we
a
haven't-
teetotaler. So but yeah, it's part of our history, right?
I think one of the hidden aspects of the museum that not a lot of people see is the research which is done.
Yes, yes.
And
And
part
it's
of that,
meticulous, isn't it?
well, it's quite meticulous, not only on the objects that we receive, but as an example, we have a boat builder on site. And when we receive a donation of a boat, you can imagine that some of them are in better repair than others. So our boat builder's task is to repair and restore those craft. When we have small craft here that have been restored, and part of the research is, how did the boat sail? We put that boat in the water.
You got to sail it.
And we take it for a sail. How close could it get to the wind? What was it like to sail that boat? And
She moves sleet through the water.
Exactly. And that is an important part of that research, because so much history relative to just the small craft has been lost. And until you document, until you thoroughly and meticulously do the research, including seeing how a heritage vessel would have sailed, you haven't completed it. And it's a lot of fun, too.
Here we are, sitting in the Halifax Harbour Explosion exhibit, recounting some of the stories from the terrible disaster that afflicted Halifax late in World War I. The result of an explosion after a collision between a munition ship, the SS Mont Blanc, and a ship that was carrying supplies for Belgian relief, the SS-EMO. And as a result of a miscommunication and navigational error, the two vessels struck in a very narrow part of Halifax Harbour. The munition ship caught fire, which attracted people from all over the city to see the spectacle in the harbour, not realizing what that vessel was carrying. And as people congregated shortly after 9 o'clock on the morning of December 6, 1917, Mont Blanc exploded, carrying over the equivalent of 2 kilotons of TNT,
Wow.
destroying a large part of the north end of Halifax, and parts of Dartmouth as well, and killing and injuring many, many people.
Most Canadians have an understanding of what happened that day. Now, my understanding, it was the biggest man-made explosion until Hiroshima.
That is generally how it's understood, definitely, and it was viewed as such by members of the Manhattan Project as well, who actually saw it as sort of a measure of the destructive capacity that they too were investigating at that time. And certainly in terms of a large explosion in a dense urban area, it was the worst catastrophe of that sort to date, most certainly.
it just flattened parts of, like, along the harbor in Halifax, correct?
It did. And the parts of the city that it affected were really some of the most vital industrial districts as well. The North End district of Richmond was one of the sort of most densely occupied parts of the town. It was a part where a lot of the shipping facilities, rail facilities, telegraph lines were located as well. And similarly, the Dartmouth shore, directly opposite the site of the explosion, was populated with industry, and most significantly, there was a large Mi'kmaq community, which is usually known as Turtle Grove as well, which was directly opposite the site of the blast and bore the direct brunt of it, and was not reestablished after the explosion.
I'm looking at the Vincent Coleman exhibit. Perhaps you can explain. We've all seen the vignette on television, and you can see it burning in the harbor, the two ships.
That's right.
And he's tapping away on the keys. Perhaps you can give us some background on this gentleman?
Absolutely. Vincent Coleman was a railway dispatcher. He worked at the Richmond rail yards, which again was one of the sort of the main transportation facilities in Halifax at the time, adjacent to Pier 6, where the blast itself occurred. And Vincent Coleman was very aware of this ship Mont Blanc on fire in the harbor, and was actually notified by boats who realized what the vessel's cargo was, that it was a munition ship on fire. Coleman realized the absolute vital importance of alerting the outside world to what was occurring and to what was about to occur as well, both to prevent additional rail traffic from coming into the city, railways being the main form of land transportation at the time, and also to ensure that the outside world knew what happened, if and when the blast occurred. So Vincent Coleman was at his telegraph key, communicating with the outside world when the blast actually occurred. And because of his heroic effort, staying at his telegraph key in the face of imminent death, he was able to alert the outside world to the fact that Halifax had just, or was in the process of suffering a major disaster. And one of the key effects was that relief trains could be organized very, very quickly. And by midnight of December 6th, the first day of the explosion itself, 6 trains of relief supplies had arrived from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick.
That's very quickly, isn't it?
Very quickly, and I think that quickness is in part attributable to Vince Coleman's heroic work on that day.
I would say so, because in the vignette they're telling him to leave, and he stays at it, right?
He does.
And he does die, yes?
He does die, and the artifacts that we have in our collection are, in fact, the telegraph key and his personal effects that were with him on the day of the
It sort of makes you wonder, what would you do in that situation?
Indeed. And, he was faced with an immediate decision to stay or to go, and he was motivated by duty.
Did he have a family?
He did indeed have a family, and actually his descendants remain connected to the museum, and the artifacts came to us through the family, and we're very thankful and appreciative for that.
Seems like this explosion brought out the better angels of our nature.
I think it really did, both on an individual level and I think on a collective level as well. Bodies like the Halifax Relief Commission, which undertook the sort of systematic reconstruction of the city afterwards. Similarly, I think was a genuine sort of philanthropic impulse, but one that was organized in a way that was able to affect change on a large scale.
Well, some good did come out of this thing.
It did. The Canadian National Institute for the Blind, for example, think of the Hydrostone district in Halifax, which is one of the first planned communities in all of Canada, and was seen as a model community, and still is today in many ways. So while the Halifax Harbor explosion was a horrific event with horrific consequences, it similarly made changes that I think made Halifax a more resilient place, and in the long run, a better place as well. This is our new exhibit, Dan Medj del Gegnu Ultieg, How Unique We Still Are. It's an exhibit that opened in November of 2021, and it was actually originally conceived as part of Halifax's bid for the North American Indigenous Games, which were to be held in Halifax in 2021 and will be held in 2023. And as part of the bid, the Nova Scotia Museum agreed to do substantial interpretation of Indigenous seafaring, and the exhibit is the result. And what we wanted to do was basically provide a platform for Mi'kmaq people who work on the waters today to express their experience and their reality, and then to provide just enough sort of historical context to see how those experiences are continuous with the millennia of Mi'kmaq occupation of this place. So we were able to speak with some really remarkable members of the Mi'kmaq community. Bernie Francis, for example, who will be familiar to some viewers. Pam Claude DeRoche, who's the director of the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center here at Halifax, and who's very involved in apprenticeship programs for shipbuilding at Irving Shipbuilding here in Halifax as well. Also with Mi'kmaq water protectors, a remarkable range of people who live and play, make their living on the water here in Mi'kmaq today.
What were the challenges in creating this exhibit during this pandemic, times of COVID?
For sure. Well, we started developing the exhibit in a pre-COVID world and opened it.
It seems so long ago, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, there were a number of challenges resulting from that. First one being that the North American Indigenous Games were repeatedly postponed, which altered our timeline. But it also presented challenges, spatial challenges as well. So what that meant in practical terms is we really had to rethink the sort of footprint of the exhibit as well to ensure that we could maintain social distancing, for example. And that's actually had some not bad consequences as well, because what it's meant is that we've been able to develop content on Mi'kmaq seafaring in the past and present throughout the museum, not just in one gallery or in one exhibit as well.
So when people arrive here, what would they expect to see?
I think one of the overarching themes of the exhibit is encapsulated in the Mi'kmaq term siawasik, which means continuation, and it really is focusing on people here today and looking at the past to the extent that it helps us to understand present-day experience. That said, the exhibit, I mean, it focuses on treaty education, so there's sort of an area for reflection in the middle of the exhibit that talks about treaty relationships and the obligations that all parties to the historical peace and friendship treaties have, and how those remain relevant today. But we also want to look at the remarkable range and variety of Mi'kmaq people's experience here today. So we look at things like, for example, the struggles over oil and gas and over environmental racism at places like Boat Harbor in Pictou County, and look at the efforts on the part of Mi'kmaq communities and Mi'kmaq individuals themselves to redress these historical wrongs. But we also look at sporting traditions as well, keeping in mind that the exhibit was originally developed in association with the North American Indigenous Games. So we look at the way in which some important sporting traditions have roots here in Mi'kmaq that remain relevant today. So we look, for example, at the canoeing history of this part of the world, but also at snowshoeing, for example, and tobogganing, hockey. Of course, Mi'kmaq people were the world's producers of the world's finest hockey sticks for at least half a century.
The very first ones, made in Windsor, Nova Scotia.
Indeed, indeed, and Mi'kmaq people on the Dartmouth Lakes producing hockey sticks for Star Manufacturing were quite prominent in the early part of the 20th century as well. So people can get a sense of those sporting traditions and their continuation into the present as well, which I think will be particularly eye-opening during the games itself, because we'll have Indigenous athletes coming from all over Turtle Island, all over North America, and they will be able to see their own experience reflected on the walls, which is not often the case, I think, when people from historically underrepresented communities come into public institutions. They don't see their own experience. They don't see people who look like them on the walls, and we're really so pleased to be taking steps to redress that.
Yeah, I'm very happy with that too, because it's a very small step towards reconciliation.
It is.
As to what's happened in the past. Now, you can't change the past, but you can make the future better.
Absolutely.
This is a very small step, but it's a step nonetheless.
It is, it is. And as Pam Claude Desrochers says, we tend to focus on reconciliation, but not so much on the truth. So one of the things that we're hoping to do here with the exhibit is to put the truth on the walls so that people can have that sort of context that will help them to understand reconciliation in a more holistic or in a fuller manner as well.
As Cromwell said, warts and all, yes?
Warts and all,
Warts and
indeed.
all.
And I think one of the key elements of that was ensuring that everything in the exhibit is in the Mi'kmaq language, and that the Mi'kmaq language is primary. So, for example, during the process of writing the exhibit, we saw the Mi'kmaq language text as the text, and if we had to alter the English language or the French language to better represent Mi'kmaq concepts, we would do that, rather than trying to shoehorn Mi'kmaq concepts into English or French language understandings. So it really is about providing a platform in which the primary nature of Mi'kmaq people's presence here is recognized and affirmed.
So you're seeing it through an indigenous or aboriginal prism as opposed to a European.
And I would take that even one step further, and that is that we're opening the museum to Mi'kmaq people themselves, who are, sort of living embodiments of that experience, so that they can express it directly to the people with as little of our sort of mediation, as little of our comment and editorializing as possible.
Which has been a great shift, because really not that long ago, this would have been done without any consultation.
Absolutely, and that's the key word, I think, consultation.
Consultation.
And we tend to think both in terms of big C consultation, where it's important that the Mi'kmaq cultural agencies and governing bodies are comfortable with how institutions are proceeding, but also small C consultation, in the sense that we want our participants to have continuing consent to the way that they're being represented. So not only did we want to make sure that they're comfortable with it now, but if they change their mind in the future, and
You'll adapt and you'll change it.
We will change it. It's a living exhibit.
Well, it's a seismic shift, because most people, certainly of my generation and older, most of their understanding of Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples tended to come from movies. And none of it was, much of it wasn't factually true. Right? And so something like this is very important to show the history as it happened by the people who are descendants of the people that were there.
Indeed, indeed. It's their experience, their narratives, their stories that they are sharing with us, and we're very grateful for that.